doing, Doc?
I need fuel.
Give me fuel, take a fly, ship me trace it out of sight.
Now, here are your hosts, John Eddie Jr. and Tom Tuttle.
Welcome back to Fantasy Fuel. The football season is almost over. The fantasy season has been over, but we're still talking. What are we going to talk about tonight, Tom?
We're going to talk about the NFC North players.
And
for fantasy purposes.
For fantasy purposes, we're going to start with the Green Bay Packers because of their devastating loss in the National Football Conference Championship game. We'll get more into that in our other episode of Fuel on the Fire because that was just a terrible performance. Will we see terrible performances out of the Green Bay Packers next year? Let's start with Aaron Rodgers. What do you think of him going into 2020?
I mean, this is going to allude to some of the next episode, but to me, it just looks like he's lost the care. And I think that makes his value somewhat worse. But for him to have better value going into next year, the value that we're used to, they need another receiver. And they need to stop doing little dump-off passes. They got to trust his arm a little bit more, although his arm doesn't look great. So it's really difficult for me to sit here and say fantasy reasons that he's going to be superb. They need a better receiver than just Adams and Lazard. It's just that feels like that's the only two guys they got, and it's just nothing else is clicking. So they got to find somebody to step up and take the, and I don't want to say Randall Cobb, but maybe the Jordy Nelson role, because Adams is Adams. He has his own role. They need somebody to take that Jordy Nelson role. They just haven't found it. Yeah,
Devontae is the only playmaker they have in the receiving game. I mean, Jimmy Graham has like one catch or two catches every 2 or 3 weeks that look awesome. You're like, oh, there's that Jimmy Graham I remember, but it's never really fully blossomed into the Jimmy Graham that we want him to be. Yep. So you talked about needing another receiver. The Packers, in my opinion, I mean, you pretty much said exactly what I thought about the game on a minimum right now.
Yeah.
The dump-offs, the offensive line play was not good. So we'll talk about what receivers they do have. Lazard came on a little bit at the end. You mentioned him. He only had 110 points on the season, but it was consistent from about week 7 or so on. He was getting targets. Not a ton. Yeah. He had a couple of good games, but then you look at some of the other guys like MVS, Marquez Valdez-Scantling. We were hoping he was going to be the guy. He had one 21-point game, one 22-point game, a 10-point game, and then he disappeared for the rest of the season. Down the stretch, he had 1.6, 0, 0, 1.7, 0, 0, 0, 1.8, and 4.1 in week 17. That is ridiculous. And then I'm trying to find Geronimo Allison.
Yeah.
He was just bad all year except for one 15-point game, one 10-point game, and then crap. Just garbage. How did Aaron Rodgers even be a somewhat decent fantasy quarterback? And I'm looking at his numbers, and it really wasn't that good this year. But overall, he ended up having an okay season. But
I think what needs to happen is Aaron Rodgers needs somebody, like maybe this is the chance for the Equinemius St. Brown to get healthy next year, and he has a chance to take a role.
There is zero reason why he wouldn't be able to have every shot at being the number 2 guy on this team next year, unless they draft or sign somebody out of free agency.
Absolutely. I mean, if he doesn't, well, they're probably going to draft somebody, I assume. They always do, and it usually doesn't work out. But, I mean, Equinemius has the body type to be a tremendous receiver. and he's not huge like the other guy we're going to talk about. I can't think of his name, Metcalf, but he's a big receiver. He's quick. He's fast. He's got good hands. He just has to one, get healthy, and he has to put it together because he hasn't really put it together since he's been in the league. But he didn't have a chance this year. So let's see what he can do next year. I'm hoping for like a really late flyer pick on him, but it's still early. We don't know who the Packers are going to get.
Yeah, unless he looks good in preseason. You don't even have to take a flyer on him. You could draft.
Well, you don't have to. I'm just saying
he will be that far under the radar, except in Wisconsin next year, that there are a million other guys that you can probably be a little more confident taking, even with a flyer pick. I love him. Yeah. You love him. He just hasn't gotten the chance yet. And with the injury, who knows if he'll ever get back to form.
Yeah, he might be just a nobody now that never plays again. Who knows?
Now, there is one interesting player going into 2020 for the Packers. That's Jace Sternberger.
Yeah.
He finally got some reps going into the playoffs. He had that touchdown against the 49ers.
Yeah.
He looks okay. And obviously Jimmy Graham is a shadow of his former self. Yeah. Mercedes Lewis was never a threat in there. The Packers themselves never really use their tight ends, but they're going to have to try something. If Sternberger is as good as he's looked, over the past couple of weeks, they're going to have to try and get the tight end involved. Although I don't know with Aaron Rodgers if he'll ever truly look for the tight end.
Well, I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen. I mean, ever since Jermichael Finley, he hasn't used tight ends at all. Like it's super, super scarce. But maybe it's really difficult to see Sternberger be something productive because there's two other tight ends on that team that we don't really know what's going to happen with them next year. Jimmy Graham's still somewhat decent. Mercedes Lewis, like you said, there's no reason for him to be on the team right now.
No.
Sternberger can completely take over that spot. But at some point, you'd think they got to get somebody. And unfortunately, I think they're looking for more of a run protection, a pass protection type of tight end because, let's face it, Aaron Rodgers just doesn't have enough protection. He sits back there for 2 seconds and he's getting hit. So the offensive line for the Green Bay Packers just isn't good enough. So I feel like they're not going to utilize the tight end the way they should because they need him in pass protection or even run protection, obviously.
Yep, I couldn't. I don't think I can add too much more to that. They need to try something different. Aaron Rodgers, like you said, we'll get into it and fuel on the fire, but he just kind of looked like, I am so over it. I have had to fight for every single point that I've got this year, and it still didn't turn into as good of a season as it actually looked on their record. I mean, we can talk about that later, but it didn't look like the Packers offenses that we were used to. I alluded to it when I was watching it with my dad last night. They just don't have that offense. They don't have even a second wide receiver, and they certainly don't have a third wide receiver where Aaron Rodgers could find those matchups, and you could spot that guy. Okay, maybe Jordy Nelson wasn't going to have 6 for 140 and 2 touchdown game, but he has 5 for 80, and then Randall Cobb gets 7 for 110 and 2 touchdowns because he found the matchup that was good that game. There were no matchups. Their wide receivers matched up horrible against everybody except for Devontae Adams. We don't really need to talk about him.
Yeah.
He was as consistent as ever except for the 4 weeks that he was injured, and that's just the way it is with him. We got one last guy we'll talk about on the Packers before moving on in the NFC North, and that was the biggest bright spot for the Packers all year long. Yes. Aaron Jones. We talked about him preseason. We'll talk about him preseason this coming year. As long as he is healthy, he should be a major part of that offense, hopefully, because we have him in a couple of leagues, I believe. Yeah,
and I expect everything that he did this year to be duplicated. especially if the Packers don't get another wide receiver. But I actually think it'd be better if they did. He'd get more surprise carries that would lead to longer runs and could up his average, which I think is already pretty good. So there's no downside to him. If it goes down, it's not going to go down by much. If it goes up, it's probably not going to go up by much. So expect about what you're going to get with him next year.
Yep, he had 1,084 rushing yards, which is average for a number one running back, but that's 4.6 yards a carry. And then you add 49 catches on top of that, and all of the touchdowns he got, which the touchdowns will probably come back to a normal-ish number next year, unless the Packers suck in the passing game again, then he might be getting touchdowns, but all in all, he'll come back down a little bit because that touchdown production is not something that is sustainable, but he's not somebody that I'm going to shy away from. He was not out for any games. I think he might have been banged up in a couple, but he never didn't dress for a game this year.
And it's been a while since the Packers have had a 1,000-yard rusher. So you're sitting here thinking, you got a 1,000-yard rusher, you got a bunch of touchdowns. LaFleur likes to run the ball. It's not that he needs to pass a little bit more, I think, just because he has to have something other than the wide receivers they got, other than Adams, like we said. But he was running the ball because he didn't have the receivers. And I think that can continue and be successful for the Packers. So I'm 100% in on him. I just I'd be a little hesitant to say that I don't think it's going to get much worse. Now, the touchdowns is the one part that gets you, because you're just thinking, man, there's no way he can get that many touchdowns again. But you never know, because if they're at the goal line and they don't trust in the wide receivers still or the tight ends,
true.
You got to do something.
You got to do something. He's proved to be a very, very, very valuable asset. Where do you think he deserves to be taking in fantasy drafts next year? Again, way too early look at this, but deserves to be taken. You're not taking him with a top 5 pick.
No.
There's way more deserving guys out there. Are you taking him towards the end of the first round, or are you going to hold off completely till the second round?
I would not. If he's in the second round, I'd be really happy with that. But I'm probably towards the end of the first. It wouldn't be in the middle. I don't think, like you said, that you can't duplicate the touchdowns. So I'm going at the end of the first. I still believe he's going to get 1,000 yards. I still believe he's going to be really productive. He's going to get his touchdowns and his receptions. And if the Packers start passing the ball even more, the receptions are going to count for more if you're in a PPR league. If you're in a standard league, that could hurt it. But I absolutely 100% think it should be at the end of the first. And if it's in the second, you got a good value.
Yep, I'd have to go down my entire list, but I'm thinking if he's there at the turn, I'm very happy. I can take him and a great number 1 wide receiver, or maybe even a second running back, depending on what's left, and be pretty happy about that. Now, we'll move on, and we'll talk about the Minnesota Vikings, and we might as well start off with a guy that probably will go top 5, even though he was injured late in the year. He put up such consistent numbers up until that fact that Dalvin Cook might have shook his stigma, but not completely.
Yeah, I think it's fine. He's 100% a top 5 running back this next year. I think he's top 5 overall. No matter what, if you think about Michael Thomas taking that spot away from him, it doesn't matter. He's top 5. He's going to be good next year, and that's, to me, the only thing the Vikings really have that is worth that type of consideration. Now, I know Thielen and Diggs are going to be drafted, somewhat high, but not anywhere close to that. And Diggs 100% has the ability to get over 1,000 yards, to get plenty of touchdowns. I mean, the guy is super talented, and I think their offensive line for running the ball is actually really good. And I don't, again, we've talked about it before, but Madison is another guy that I would like to take late, or maybe just, grab him off of the waiver wire at some point if he's still there, because that offensive line and both of them running backs are really good. And if I have Cook, I really want Madison.
Yep. That's the biggest thing right now, is if you're going to take Dalvin Cook with a top 5 selection, maybe even top 3, depending on your league settings, because he had a ton of receptions. And the weird thing about that is, out of 53 catches, he didn't have any touchdowns receiving. So you would think that he can only add 2 or 3 touchdowns probably at a minimum if they pass it to him as much as they did this coming season. You could probably expect 15 to 16 touchdowns out of him overall, running and receiving. He averaged about 4.5 yards a carry, which is about what Madison averaged. Madison actually averaged higher yards per catch, but he only had 10 catches. So I think no matter who the running back for Minnesota is next year, you're going to be fine. So if you handcuff Madison, this is one of the few handcuffs out there that I will be confident with. Like, you don't want to handcuff everybody, because sometimes they just aren't good. We've seen so many, the backup for so-and-so, he's the starter now because he's hurt for the rest of the year, and you go scoop him up and you use all your fab budget, and he ends up getting 2.5 yards a carry and maybe a touchdown the rest of the way, and you just wasted it. But Madison, I believe, is one of those guys that he will not be wasted, and you can be confident having him when Dalvin Cook has a week off somewhere down the line. Yeah. He still hasn't played a full season.
Right. And here's the thing with Cook. I mean, people don't really realize it, but week 7, 8, 9, and 10, he had 25, 23, 21, and 26 attempts rushing the ball. And then after that, the Vikings completely changed what they did. They went week 11, he only had 11 attempts. And then week 13, because they had a bye week 12. Week 13, 9 attempts. Week 14, 18, so that's not bad. But then week 15, 9 again, and then he didn't play week 16 or 17. So they went away from running the ball because they felt like, this is my opinion, I feel like they felt like they needed to prove that they could pass the ball more and rely on Kirk to get far into the playoffs. It didn't happen because Kirk is Kirk, and that's what happens when you got him on your team. But I feel like that's what they were trying to do. They were like, we know we can do well with Cook, but we can't win in the playoffs on just him. So they needed to try something. That's my opinion. I didn't get that from any source or anything like that, but you can kind of just see that's kind of what was going on.
And they also can't win with what they ended up doing either, because they got trounced by the San Francisco 49ers in the second round of the playoffs after doing a great defensive effort in the first round against the Saints. That's the only reason they won that game, is they were able to hold the Saints down. They did not do it offensively. So going into next year, Kirk Cousins is still going to be one of those guys that I'm not drafting almost for any reason. He actually averaged a little less than Rodgers did. I think he was a little more consistent in how he scored his points compared to Rodgers. Yeah. But it's just, he started off the season with 4 bad games in a row before, Kirk Cousins, see, I told you he was good. Had 3 good games in a row, and then a bad, and then a good, and a good, and a good, and then it just went down every game the last 4 games of the season. He didn't play week 17 because they didn't need to. They already had their position wrapped up. But it just kept getting worse towards the end of the season. I'm not sure what to think about that. But like I said, that's because they pass the ball too many times. He's not good when you have to pass the ball. So he can't get the fantasy numbers, even though passing the ball, you would think, oh, good, he's going to throw it again. No, not with Kirk Cousins. It's completely opposite. He's better when there's a balance. It can't obviously be all running, but there has to be a certain type of balance. They didn't have the balance at the end of the season, like I said. So he's just not good when it's all on him. And, of course, we have to talk about Thielen and Diggs. Thielen had
Yeah,
an unbelievably bad year overall. He had a couple of good weeks. He started off average, and then he was just not there.
That's because he had injuries that he just could not recover from. It's constant. Like, he'd get about out there, and I started him on my fantasy team, and I'm thinking, okay, good. I got Thielen now. This is all good. And this was in the listener league.
Yes.
I'm sitting there thinking, oh, finally got Thielen. Here we go. And then he gets a touchdown. Luckily, I got some kind of points out of him, but he gets hurt. And then, like, he gets 2 weeks off because of the injury or whatever it is. And he comes back and, like, immediately gets hurt again. It's like, this is just not good. If he's not ready to go, don't put him out there.
And
I don't need this in my fantasy league right now.
And you picked up a guy to back up Thielen, and I picked up a guy to just fill in here and there. Olabisi Johnson. He actually got a decent amount of targets overall for the playing time he got, but you could never play him on the weeks where he got a decent amount of points. You know, I'm talking like 14, 8, 9, like in the flag league, that's a decent, score out of your 10th flex option or whatever it is. And he couldn't fill the bill of Adam Thielen. Now,
and I think the problem with him is he's a rookie. I mean, you got to give him time. And this is why I really think he's got a future. On the Vikings, just because if they're going to do any type of passing at all, they have to rely on him more, because the Thielen just isn't as healthy as you want him to be. Diggs is still good. I really like Diggs still. And as far as fantasy goes, we didn't really cover Diggs, but I expect him to be, somewhat high. I'm going to probably take him in the 3rd round if possible. And then Thielen has that injury issue. BC Johnson is the guy that really has the opportunity to step up and take a role for this team. And then you can get him. You probably don't have to draft him at this point. He's still not known at all by anybody. So at this point, I'm taking him either really late and getting a good value, because I really think, and I have to look it up, but I think he's almost better when Thielen was out there. So it almost makes it like he's the 3rd guy. I'm not gonna say this as fact because I don't have that numbers in front of me. But from what I remember, saying, "Oh, Thielen's back. I can't start BC. I gotta go here." And every time I'm like, frick, BC got like 15 points. What's going on here?
Yeah, it was an odd season overall for all of the Minnesota Vikings wide receivers. I'm looking at Diggs stats here. He's a guy that I have never touched, and I probably still will not touch, because his points came in bunches. He had half of his touchdowns in one game against the Eagles against their terrible cornerbacks. Yes, great. If you started him, good. But that was the first real good game that he had of the year. So at that point, people were probably benching Diggs. So if you didn't get those points, but then kept starting him, you did okay the rest of the way, because he had 3 20-point games, a couple of 15-ish point games, and mostly double digits down the stretch. He's actually, I'm looking at his numbers, and he looks a lot like Deshaun Jackson's numbers do. He has 63 catches for 1,130 yards and 6 touchdowns. Like, if that's not a Deshaun Jackson line, I don't know what is. And so if he can be consistent enough with the targets he's getting, because after that 46-point game against the Eagles, he never had less than 5 targets in a game. And when he did catch, most of those targets, he had a decent amount of yards, and he did you okay. So he's not a horrible option, but you probably will have to take him in the 3rd round, and I don't know that I'm going to like him there.
I've never taken him, and I'm looking at it, and you know how I am about consistency. And like you said, after that week 6, because there's no way I'm starting him week 6.
Right.
After the terrible first 5 weeks, there's no chance I'm starting him week 6. But after that, it was really consistent except for 2 weeks. Everything else was super consistent, and I love the consistency when it comes to that. So I might take a chance on Diggs this next year, which I've never done before. So we'll see what happens. But a lot of things got to fall in place before I can make a commitment to him. But I like where he's at the moment.
All right, let's move along to the Chicago Bears.
Oh, do we have to?
We do have to.
Oh, man.
There was one player on this team that I accidentally drafted in one league because my timer ran out, and it was one of the best picks I had in that draft. Allen Robinson.
Yeah.
That was the only consistent guy on that entire team all year long. So if you had him, you were fine. He's probably worthy of a 3rd or 4th round pick this coming year. He averaged 16 points a game in the flag league, so that's good enough for that kind of consideration. But we are not 100% sure what they're going to have at quarterback next year. Is Trubisky going to keep downgrading himself every year he's in the league? Or
it can't get much worse. It can't get much worse. I have to imagine that if Trubisky is still the quarterback, which I assume he will be, that it's still going to be quite a bit of Allen Robinson. If it's not Trubisky, then great. It doesn't hurt Allen Robinson. Here's the thing. Robinson has had in the flag league only 3 weeks where he was under 10 points. That's as consistent as it gets. And to me, he's absolutely 100% worth a 3rd round pick. And I would love having him there.
Yep. Let's just kind of run down the list of other guys that might have some impact. I mean, David Montgomery had a few good games, but he was not consistent.
Yeah.
Well, I won't say he wasn't consistent because he got 7 points or more a game pretty much every week in some manner, whether it be 25 points against the Eagles because he had 2 touchdowns. Then you can look at 135-yard and 1 touchdown performance against the Chargers. Then he had a receiving touchdown against the Lions. And then he had 113 yards and a touchdown against the Vikings in Week 17 that didn't matter to the Vikings. So there was all sorts of different ways that he scored points. He just wasn't consistent enough to want to put into your starting lineup because it was usually single digits for him.
Yeah, he's got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks where and if you started him for some reason in your Super Bowl game, he gave you 9 points, but he gave you 8 weeks for less than 10 points. That's half the season. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable.
Nope.
Not acceptable.
Not acceptable. Yes, he was a rookie. Yes, he might be a little better next year.
Oh, I'm sure he will be, yes.
But that Bears offense looked nothing like it did the year before when we were telling everybody to go out and get Tariq Cohen. This year we kind of said, hey, you might want to stay away from him. Now in the flag league, he was still okay because he had a lot of kick return yards and punt return yards. Right. But overall, I mean, he had 79 catches, but he had 456 yards and only 3 touchdowns. And he only had 200 yards rushing. Like, that's not what we thought we were going to get out of Tariq Cohen, especially after my guy, Mike Davis, ended up being a complete and utter bust. I thought, okay, well, if it's not a 3-headed monster, then why isn't Tariq Cohen getting more catches and more opportunities with this football? Because Mitch Trubisky was not getting him the ball in good enough situations. I mean, I know there's a game, if I can find it really quick, he had 9 catches for 44 yards. Another game, 7 catches for 29 yards. Like, how?
29
yards.
Catches. That's crazy.
Yeah. So going into next year, Tariq Cohen is going to be another wild card. He probably will fall in drafts, and he might be a decent value next year if you can get anywhere close to 2018 version of Tariq Cohen. But
that's what you would be hoping for at that point, because I don't know how much I can trust it, but I wouldn't mind taking a gamble late. But there's no way I'm taking him where I probably took him this last year.
And there was really, other than David Montgomery, there was no rookies to really watch out for. A second-year player in Anthony Miller, he started coming on towards the end of the year. Yeah. But it's just been a hit or miss amongst that whole team. And I'm sure you don't even want to talk about Chicago Bears tight ends, so we can skip to the last team in that division if you'd like.
Trey Burton. Can we play the sad music or whatever this is? Because this was just the worst. That's it. Yeah. Trey Burton, why? Please tell me why you did so poorly. I had to trade for somebody else because you did so bad. Why? That's all.
All right. Well, yeah, that's all you need to know about Chicago Bears tight ends this last year.
Oh, that was
In
so
specific,
bad.
Trey Burton, he was absolutely terrible and then was injury prone. And yeah,
On IR. Yep.
and IR. So we got one team left, and that is the good old Detroit Lions, who have less quarterbacks drafted on their entire history of the team that have ever made the Super Bowl. They have less quarterbacks drafted than the Detroit Tigers do. Detroit Tigers actually selected Pat Mahomes in one of their, picks later on and stuff. So yes, the Detroit Tigers have drafted more Super Bowl quarterback players than the Detroit Lions have. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
David Blau.
No, they do have a really good quarterback on their team still. Matt Stafford was actually having a really good fantasy season up until he got hurt. And the beneficiary of Matt Stafford's great season, and still even after he was hurt, Kenny Golladay. This guy seems like he is going to be... I might see him go towards the end of the second round next year. He'll be a third-round player probably in most cases, but I could see him if he's getting any hype and Stafford's saying, I feel ready. This is the best shape I've been in years. Kenny Golladay is going to get the hype train rolling real soon.
Yep, absolutely. And like you said on Stafford, amazing year. I mean, he had a couple not the greatest weeks, but everything else was over. He had one that wasn't over 30 points, but everything else was over 30 points other than the 3 games that I mentioned. So he's a really good fantasy quarterback. The Lions need a lot of help everywhere else.
Yes, they do.
But that's besides the point. We're not talking about that. We're talking about fantasy. So honestly, if Stafford's available and he's in the late rounds, it's worth picking him up because he's still getting the fantasy numbers. Now, go ahead and talk about something because I got to look up the actual stats for this. Just give me a second.
Yep. Well, their other wide receiver that ended up being out the last few games was Marvin Jones, and he was fine. He averaged 15 points a game in the flag league, which is still a great wide receiver, 2, 3, wherever you've got him at. So he's still a decent player. Again, with the not as many catches, but he had touchdowns. He had 9 touchdowns this last season before going on IR in Week 15. So Marvin Jones is still going to be a consistent player, probably with pretty much any quarterback. And then you had Danny Amendola step up for a few games. So even David Blau was okay getting some points out of the wide receivers. So what were the stats you were looking up?
Okay, now this is going to sound strange because I know a couple of weeks ago I said that if you put it on average, that Tannehill was the second best quarterback in the league. Well, that was because you had to take out the that first week where he came in to the game. So I took that one out. Tannehill was the second best. Still the second best if you do that. But if you're looking at just pure stat averages, Matthew Stafford was second best with 29 average points per game. Obviously way behind Lamar Jackson. But I mean, that's telling you that Stafford still has the fantasy production. So don't sleep on him because you can get a really good value late with him because nobody's going to take him.
Don't sleep on him. Probably because their running game was atrocious after Kerryon Johnson got injured and went out for 7 weeks. And even he wasn't the greatest. But yeah, that's what we're leading into. Will Kerryon Johnson have any impact? I mean, versus the Packers week 17, they came out and started to surprise them until the Packers came back and won that game. But he only had 11 carries for 53 yards and put up a touchdown. But you can see they are still not a running team. Matt Stafford, as long as he is in Detroit, is going to put up amazing numbers fantasy-wise. I mean, in just 8 games, he had 2,500 yards. So guess what? He was on pace for 5,000 yards. He had 19 touchdowns. So on pace for 38 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions in 8 games. So only 10 with as much passing as he does. Those are insane numbers. and he's going to be a guy that you can get late. Just wait on your quarterback next year. I'm telling you again and again and again, we're not taking Rodgers early. We're not taking Lamar Jackson because he's going to be a second or third round pick. Patrick Mahomes is still going to be a second or third round pick in a lot of these leagues. You don't have to do it. There's guys like Matt Stafford who he's had 8 games, a half a season to sit out and heal up, and he will be ready to go when next season comes along, and Matt Stafford will be the guy that you can just rely on. He had one bad year last year, and I told you guys to go out and get him this year. Unfortunately, he got hurt, but there's no reason after 10 years in the league to suspect that Matt Stafford was going to have 2 bad years in a row. There was no reason for that. No.
Right, and then to go back to Kerryon Johnson, I just want to say this real quick. The thing with him is that if you sort it by average, because you have to.
Yes,
because
of course.
You have so many weeks that he missed because of the injury. If you sort it by average, he's the 32nd running back on average. So that's the last guy. The last guy you want. I don't want that. I mean, you have him. He's barely a flex to me.
Barely.
I don't even want to use him. I'm sitting there thinking, oh, who else do I got? Oh, I got Kerryon Johnson. Who else do I got? That's honestly what I'd be thinking.
Well, you got to talk about a tight end last time. I'm talking about a tight end this time. We started off, and I thought I was on point. I was telling you a couple of these rookies were going to be so good this year. And T.J. Hawkinson came out a slinging 25 points in week 1. 6 catches, 130 yards, and a touchdown. That is awesome out of a rookie tight end. Well, he scored a total of 50 more points across the entire season after a 25-point performance in week 1. So, TJ, can we get a little more consistency out of you next year? Maybe it was Matt Stafford. Maybe it was you just not having, a grasp of the offense. But you were such a great receiving threat. You can do it. I have faith in you. But holy crap, did you make me look stupid this year.
Yeah, Week 2, negative 0.3 points.
Yes.
Week 3, negative 0.4 points. This isn't a flag league, so it's a little skewed from other things. And then we had a week 8, 0.8 points. Week 11, 0.1 points. Week 12, nothing at all.
2
and
targets.
Everything else was below 10.
Yeah.
That's just
and
bad.
And then versus the Bears, the last game that he got to play, he had 6 catches, 18 yards. That's just pathetic. So we're ranting about our tight ends again this year, but that's going to wrap it up for us for the NFC North. There's a lot of question marks going into next year with every single team, so it is a division to really keep your eye on because fantasy-wise, there's a lot of options there and a lot of comeback player of the year options if you can pick out the right ones, like Matt Stafford. If you can wait and get him, he could be that guy. Get you 40 touchdowns and 5,000 yards passing. It's a real possibility.
It is.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you're on twitch.tv/fantasyfuel, we appreciate it. We've got a long off season, but if you want to join us, we've got another podcast called Fantasy Fuel on the Fire that we're going to transition into here in a moment. We'll just talk about football and what it means to us and how annoying some things are and all these other good things. So, again, thanks for listening, and don't forget to stay fueled up this really long off season.